Hello and welcome back to another Games Workshop painting tutorial. In this video I'll be showing you how you can paint the Deathwatch Captain Artemis using the Citadel range of paints to do so. So here we have our Watch Captain Artemis, and as you can see I've already primed it using the Army Painter's Matte Black Spray Primer. And this is because most of the armour is black, so it just saves painting it on with a brush later on. Now you may also notice I've split it down into several parts, so we've got the main head, torso and the legs here, but then we've also got the right arm and the cloak as in a separate piece, and then the left arm with the sword there, and then finally the actual power plant backpack as well. So these areas have all been kept separate, as it makes painting into the recesses much easier. So the first area to paint is the skin, and we'll be starting off with a base coat of Bugmans Glow, followed by a mixture of Lahmian Medium and Cadian Fleshtone, which we'll be applying as a glaze across the skin, before highlighting it with Kislev Flesh. The final step is to wash over the entirety of the area with Reikland Fleshshade. Now the reason why we're painting the face first is just in case we do overspill onto the neck guard, and if this happens then all we need to do is just paint over with some Abaddon Black just to cover up our mistakes, and we don't need to completely re-highlight. Now I've just mixed in a small amount of water with this mixture here just to improve the flow slightly. I just want to get a really nice and even coverage across the skin area. With the Bugmans Glow dried, the next step is to apply a glaze of Cadian Fleshtone. Now I've made this glaze from 1 part Lahmian Medium to 1 part Cadian Fleshtone. I'm going to be applying this over the entirety of the skin. You can see here it almost acts like a wash. It just acts as a layer there, just over the entirety there. I only want it to be very, very thin. We don't want it to be too thick or too bright. We just want to get a nice and even skin tone from this. Following the glaze, we want to bring out some of the facial features, and we're doing this with a highlight of Kislev Flesh, and I'll just be picking out the nose here, and also across the cheekbones, just very carefully applying a thin highlight. I've mixed in a small amount of water here as well, just so it's not so thick, just across the brow as well, just anywhere where we've got raised features that we would want to bring out. To finish off the skin, a wash of Reikland Fleshshade can be applied, and this will pull into all of the recesses and really bring out that definition. Now I've watered this down slightly just so I don't want to be too strong as to make the skin quite dark. We just want to have a very, very subtle wash across the surface. With the skin completed, the next step is to paint the armour, and we'll be starting off with a highlight of Stegadon Scale Green, followed by a second highlight of Thunderhawk Blue, before finally an extreme highlight of Fenrisian Grey. The first stage of highlighting is to highlight with the Stegadon Scale Green, and we just want to apply thin lines across all of the armour panels. We don't need to worry about being too thin at this stage, as we'll be improving these highlights with later steps. And one trick is just to drag your brush perpendicular against the edge very gently, and this creates a nice line, and we'll be doing this across the entirety of the armour. With the Thunderhawk Blue, we want to focus our attention along the top edges, so for example on the knee pad here we're just going to be focusing this highlight along the top there, just applying a very thin line like before. And again, any areas where you'd imagine the light would be hitting from directly above, we want to focus on those. So for example, the top of the neck guard as well, which would be dragging the brush perpendicular to the edge along there. So the final step for painting the armour is to just apply some very small amounts of Fenrisian Grey across these corner sections. So you can see here we've got this corner just in the armour panel. Dot of Fenrisian Grey, the same along the top here, and basically anywhere where we've got a line of Thunderhawk Blue, and then we've got a corner there as well, so just along this top of the knee pad, very fine lines, as you can see there, and it just finishes off the highlights nicely. With the armour completed, the next step is to paint the cloak and also the weapon stock as well. And we're starting off with a base coat of Khorne Red. Next we'll be doing a highlight of Evil Sunz Scarlet, followed by a wash of Carroburg Crimson, before finishing off with a very fine highlight of Firedragon Bright. Now all of the red areas on the miniature, including the cloak, the stock, and also some of the items on the front of the miniature as well, we'll be painting using the Khorne Red base coat. And I've mixed in a small amount of water here. This will just give me a really nice and even coverage over the cloak. And what I'll be doing is I'll be applying this first coat, waiting for this to thoroughly dry, before applying a second one over the top. For this step I've mixed in 1 part Evil Sunz Scarlet with 1 part Lahmian Medium, just to create this nice glaze. And what we do is we apply this over the raised sections of the cloak. And you can see here as it applies over the top, it's still quite translucent, it's not really dry, not really bright, sorry. So what we do is we apply a few layers, build them up as we get closer to this ridge here, and this creates some really nice gradients on the cloak. For areas such as the bolter and also some of the grenades on the miniature, we only need to do a highlight along the edges, so we don't need to use the glaze here, we can just use it straight out of the pot, just mixed in with a small amount of water, and we're just going to be dragging the brush along these edges like so, just to create a nice highlight, as you can see I'm doing here. As you can see, the pits and troughs have been enhanced by the glaze that we applied in the previous step. However, we're going to be further enhancing these by applying a wash of Carroburg Crimson. I've mixed in roughly 1 pot water to 1 pot Carroburg Crimson, because out of the pot it's a little bit too strong and we don't want to overpower the blending. And what we'll do is apply this over the entirety of the red areas, including this cloak here. And this will blend in the glazed layers that we paste on in the previous step, and really enhance the definition in the troughs. For this step, I'll be using the Firedragon Bright as an extreme highlight. So for the folds, we just want to apply a very thin line of the Firedragon Bright just along the ridge there. I've watered it down slightly just so it's not as overpoweringly bright. And also be picking out the very tips of the cloak there as well, just very carefully running my brush along the edge. In addition to that, we'll also be highlighting the other red areas of the miniature, such as the stock of the weapon. But this time we'll just be focusing on areas such as the corners. So for example, just this little corner here. I'll just be very carefully just dabbing my brush onto there to create a nice corner highlight, like so. With the red areas completed, the next step is to paint the inside of the cloak and also any parchment areas across the miniature, such as on the shoulder pad here, but also on the legs and also the hair as well. We're starting off, first of all, with a base coat of Rakarth Flesh, followed by a wash of Seraphim Sepia, before highlighting with the Ushabti Bone, and finally white scar mixed with Lahmian Medium. Applying the Rakarth Flesh over the black areas can be a little bit tricky, but as it's a base paint it should cover really nicely. But I've mixed in just a small amount of water here just to thin it down slightly, and I'll be applying 2 thin coats as opposed to 1 thick one, and this will give us the best coverage possible. With the Rakarth Flesh dry, we've got this really nice base colour in which to build up from, so we'll be applying this wash of Seraphim Sepia over the surface, and I've mixed in roughly 1 part water to 1 part Seraphim Sepia, so we don't want it to be too strong and too overpowering. We just want to achieve a nice subtle sepia tone to the cloak, and also to pull into the recesses and really bring out that definition. And I'll be doing this across the cloak and also any other areas that we've painted with Rakarth Flesh in the previous step. Now that the wash of Seraphim Sepia is dried, we can now start working on the Ushabti Bone. Now I've mixed this in with roughly 1 part Ushabti Bone to 1 part Lahmian Medium, just to really thin it down and to create this nice glaze. I'm going to be focusing on the raised sections. You can see the raised fabric here, and we're going to leave the darker Seraphim Sepia stained Rakarth Flesh visible in the recesses, but these tips here that we've got, and also these raised folds, we'll be picking out using the Ushabti Bone. And once the first layer is dry, you can also apply second layers, and this will really improve the gradient between the colours. The final step is to pick out some of these stronger folds, and I'll be using a white scar mixed in roughly equal quantities with Lahmian Medium. I'm just going to be very thinly applying this across, like so, just a very thin line just to denote where the fold is. I'm doing this on across the entirety of the miniature wherever we've got the Rakarth Flesh base paints that we've been working on, just picking out very sharp corners like these. With the cloak and the parchment areas completed, the next step is to start painting some of the skull iconography, such as this on the shoulder here, and also any purity seals on the miniature. Now we're starting off with a base coat of Celestra Grey, followed by a wash of Nuln Oil, before finally highlighting with white scar. So as always, make sure you mix in just a small amount of water with this base layer, and this is perfect because it gives us a really nice light grey base in which to build up from, and it maintains a white effect, which can be notoriously difficult to achieve on these kind of miniatures. In order to enhance the definition on these areas, I'm going to be washing over the area with a very watered down Nuln Oil. It's roughly about 2 parts water to 1 part Nuln Oil, and as you see when I apply it over, it's barely noticeable. We just want a very small amount just to pull into the recesses and really bring out those definitions. The final step in painting these white areas is to just very finely pick out the detailing using white scar, and as you can see here I'm just going to be picking out the skull detailing just like so, very carefully with my brush here, very gently applying the white scar, and the same goes for the text that we've got either side here. Now when you come to paint any parchment or scrolls, you want to just highlight the edges of the scroll using the white scar. With the grey and white areas completed, the next step is to start painting some of the pouches that you can just see along the waist there. And we're starting off first of all with a base coat of dried bark, followed by a highlight of Gorthal Brown, before finishing off with an extreme highlight of Baneblade Brown. As with previous base coats, I've mixed in some water into this colour, and it just thins it out slightly so I can get a better, more even coverage over the area. And because of the nature of base paints, there's a lot more higher pigment levels in them, so you can usually just apply 1 coat, but generally speaking 2 thin coats is better. With the Gorthor Brown, I'll be dragging the brush along the edges of these pouches here, just to create a nice highlight. Again, just make sure the brush is perpendicular to the edge, and just very lightly drag, and you get this nice thin highlight line. With the brown leather pouches completed, the next step is to start painting the black and yellow chevron pipe that's leading from the bolt gun. And for this I'll be starting off with a base coat of Averland Sunset, followed by Yriel Yellow, before painting over the black areas with Abaddon Black. When painting the chevrons, I would recommend mixing in some water into the mix just to improve the flow slightly. And what you want to do is you want to, first of all, just start painting some yellow lines like so, roughly the distance apart that you actually want your chevrons to be in thickness. And then you fill the gaps in like so, just painting in between the two lines, and then you'll do the same, moving along, yellow line, and the second yellow line, and then just fill in the gaps in between. With the Yriel Yellow, we just want to focus on these upper edges here. Just want to paint a very fine line along the yellow, just to lighten up ever so slightly. Just be very careful not to apply too much, as you don't want to overpower the yellow. Just a small amount again on each of these chevrons. The final step in painting the chevrons is just knitting up the lines using the Abaddon Black. I'm just going to be very carefully just applying it over these sections here, just to neaten it up and just cover up any spillages that we made in the previous steps. The next step is to paint the small dome on the wrist guard there. And first of all, we'll be starting off with a base coat of Temple Guard Blue, followed by a highlight of a Baharroth Blue. Using a thin brush, just mix in a small amount of water into the mix, or if you're using a wet palette, it shouldn't matter. And we're just going to make sure we cover the entirety of this little dome here with the Temple Guard Blue. Just be very careful not to overspill onto the black areas. With the base layer completed, we now want to enhance the glowing effect. I'm just be doing this with the Baharroth Blue and just painting it onto the center of the dome like so. The next step is to paint all of the silver metallic areas, and we're doing this in several different stages. But first of all, we want to apply a nice base layer onto all of the areas using Leadbelcher. When painting these silver metallic areas, do make sure that you check out some of the pre-painted miniatures on the Games Workshop website to find out exactly which areas should be painted silver and which areas should be painted gold. And as you can see here, I'm making sure I apply it over all of the relevant areas, and I've mixed in just a small amount of water here just to improve the flow, so I'm not applying it too thickly, and it just makes covering much more easy. With the Leadbelcher base coat completed, the next step is to wash over the pipes, the grenades that we've got on either side here, and then if I just bring in the cloak with the arm, we're going to be washing over the bolter stock as well, and we're washing over all of those areas with Nuln Oil. However, we're going to be washing over the actual bionic arm with Agrax Earthshade instead. And then once that's done, we're going to be highlighting all of these areas that we've washed over with Ironbreaker. So first of all, I've got my Agrax Earthshade washed in. I'm going to be applying this over the bionic arm. This will give it this nice oily, dirt-ridden effect. You can just about see it there. It offers some transition between the other silver areas on the miniature. It just gives it a slightly brown tinge, and making sure that it pools into all these recesses, such as around the hand here as well. But just make sure there's an overspill onto the non-bionic hand areas either. So next we're just going to be washing over the other silver areas with the Nuln Oil, and this will just pool into the recesses and really bring out the definition in these details that you can see here. And also darken it slightly, which will make the Ironbreaker highlight that we're applying next stand out that bit more. So now we'll be highlighting with the Ironbreaker. It's just a case of dragging the brush along these edges here, both on the Nuln Oil washed areas and also the Agrax Earthshade washed bionic arm as well. And again, we're just going to be focusing on these edges here, running our brush along there, and just this will bring out the edges and to really enhance the detailing. The next step is to paint all of the silver areas, notably the left arm that we've got here. We're painting this all entirely the same way, as well as the Aquila that's on the chest there as well, painting this the same. First of all, we'll be starting off with a layer of Ironbreaker, followed by a wash of Guilliman Blue, mixed with some Lahmian Medium, before finally highlighting with Stormhost Silver. So the first step just involves painting a layer over the top here, and we just want to leave the darker Leadbelcher visible in the recesses, but we want to bring out both the highlights and also some of the flat areas with the Ironbreaker. We want to make this a lot lighter than the rest of the silver on the miniature. Now the next step is to wash over all the areas that we painted in the previous step with a mixture of Lahmian Medium and Guilliman Blue, and I've mixed them in roughly equal quantity, so 1 part Guilliman Blue to 1 part Lahmian Medium. I'm going to be washing this over the entirety of the area, and it'll give us this really nice subtle blue tint to the silver, and you can see it's just pooling into all of the recesses there. And the reason why I've used Lahmian Medium instead of water because this isn't technically a wash, it's a glaze, so it works slightly differently than that, so I've just mixed in some more Lahmian Medium instead, and this will give us a really nice and even blue tint over the silver areas. The final step in painting these blue-silver areas is to highlight them with Stormhost Silver, and I'm just going to be very carefully picking out these edges here, making them a lot lighter than the rest of the miniature, and this will give us a really nice bright glow along the edges, really bring out the detailing as well. Now if you want to as well, you can also drag the brush along the inscriptions on the shoulder pad there. This will really help to bring out these details. The next step in painting our Deathwatch is to pick out all of the gold areas. This includes the belt there, the crest on the shoulder, also some items just on the legs there, and anywhere else where we haven't actually painted yet. We'll be painting first of all with a base coat of Retributor Armour, followed by a wash of Reikland Fleshshade before highlighting again with Stormhost Silver. Again, with the base coat, just make sure you don't overspill into any of the areas we've already painted, and we just want to pick out all of the gold detailing across the chest here. Very, very carefully here. I'm using this thin brush. I've just mixed in just a small amount of water, just enough that's provided by using my wet palette, and this will just help the flow of the paint across the surface. The next step after applying the Retributor Armour is to wash over it with Reikland Fleshshade, and the reason why we're using the Fleshshade to wash over it is because it really gives it this nice reddish tint, and if you can just see it on the chest there, it pulls into all the recesses, brings out all the detail as we would expect from a wash, but it also gives us really nice burnished metal colour. You can just about see on this pendant there. With the wash dried, the final step is to just highlight over these gold areas with Stormhost Silver. I've just got a small amount of my brush here. I'm just going to be dragging it very carefully over these surfaces just to really bring out the detail on these gold sections. The final step in painting this miniature is to paint the power sword, and first of all we're starting off with a glaze of Temple Guard Blue, followed by a glaze and a highlight of Baharroth Blue. So this glaze consists of 1 part Temple Guard Blue to 2 parts Lahmian Medium. I'm just going to be applying this over the sword. As you can see here, we've already got a silver base, which acts as a nice starting point for the power sword. But this Baharroth Blue glaze will just kind of pool over the surface. You'll still be able to see the metallic paint, but it will give this nice electronic sheen over the top. With the first glaze dried, the next step is to form a second glaze. This time we're going to be focusing on some of the edge of the blaze, and this is a mixture of 1 part Lahmian Medium to 1 part Baharroth Blue. So we're going to be creating a gradient going from the tip here, just on one side of the blade, and then just down at the bottom here as well. Now I'd highly recommend taking a look at the GW's studio miniatures as an idea how to apply this glaze, but once we've done that for this side, the next side will just be just in the center there, and applying it in the center and then feathering it out as we get towards either end. Pretty much the opposite of what we did on either side of the blade. Now once this is dried, what we can do is we can use some Baharroth Blue straight out of the pot, mixed in with just a small amount of water, just to highlight these edges here and then also the very edges of the blade as well. And here we have the completed Artemis, who you can see I've assembled and based. Now whilst this tutorial focused on the Deathwatch Captain Artemis, you could apply the exact same techniques to any of the Deathwatch members. Now if you enjoyed this tutorial, please do let me know in the comments below, and also hit the subscribe button to be kept up to date with all of my future videos. Additionally, if you'd like to support me in making more tutorials, you can do so by heading on over to my Patreon page, which you can find a link to on the screen now or in the description below. From there, you'll be able to donate to me from as little as $1 a month, which will just really help me in making future content. If you would like to find out what projects I'm currently working on, do check out my Facebook and Instagram pages, which you can find links to in the description. And finally, until next time, thanks for watching and goodbye.